Listen carefully. For 2.5 centuries, Roman soldiers, the men who conquered continents, who built roads through mountains, who held together the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, were legally forbidden from owning land, marrying legally recognized wives, or accumulating inheritable wealth during their service. You've been taught this was military discipline, organizational necessity, strategic brilliance. That explanation is a lie designed to obscure what was actually happening. The systematic economic exploitation of the very men who made Rome possible, and the deliberate machinery built to ensure that soldiers could never translate military power into political or economic independence. Right now, scattered across museum archives and mistranslated papyri, evidence exists that Roman military policy wasn't about creating better fighters. It was about creating a permanent underclass of armed men who could never threaten the senatorial aristocracy that sent them to die. The property prohibition wasn't strategy, it was control, and what it reveals about how empires manufacture consent from their own enforcers will make you question every military structure that's existed since. Here's what we know for certain. From the Marian reforms in 1007 BCE until the Severan dynasty around 1907 CE, Roman soldiers were explicitly barred from legal marriage and property ownership during their 25-year service terms. This wasn't custom. This was law, enforced through military courts, with penalties including execution for officers who violated it. A soldier could fight for Rome for a quarter century, could survive Germania's forests and Parthia's deserts, could watch his brothers die in formation beside him. And at the end, if he survived, he received a small plot of land in some frontier province far from his birthplace, deliberately isolated from political centers of power. Read that again. 25 years of service, no legal family, no property, no accumulated wealth to pass to children, then exile to the edges of empire disguised as reward. The machinery is right there in the sources, but historians have spent 2,000 years calling it military efficiency instead of what it actually was, systematic dispossession. Picture this: you're a Roman citizen in 100 BCE. You're not wealthy. You don't own the massive agricultural estates the senatorial class controls. You work land your family has held for generations, maybe 5 or 6 iugara, just enough to qualify for military service under the old property requirements. Then Gaius Marius changes everything. He opens the legions to the capite censi, the head count, men with no property at all. Suddenly, military service isn't a citizen duty tied to land ownership, it's a profession. And the senators who control Rome realize something crucial. If soldiers can own property, if they can marry legally, if they can accumulate wealth and pass it to legitimate heirs, they become a political class. They become voters with economic interests. They become men who might ask why they're dying to secure grain supplies that only enrich the aristocracy, or why they're conquering provinces whose wealth flows exclusively to senatorial governors. So the law changes. Property ownership during service becomes forbidden. Legal marriage becomes impossible. The justification given in military manuals is unit cohesion, preventing conflicts of interest, maintaining focus. But look at what the law actually accomplishes. It ensures that the men with weapons never become the men with power. This is the part historians rarely mention because it implicates the entire Roman political structure. Veterans were promised land grants upon discharge, the famous viritani assignments that supposedly took care of Rome's soldiers. But examine the records carefully. Notice where the land was located. Notice the pattern. Veterans weren't being given property in Latium or Campania, the wealthy heartlands where political power resided. They were being shipped to newly conquered frontiers, Germania, Britannia, Dacia, North Africa. They were being used as colonial settlement forces, planted in hostile territories to Romanized provinces, while simultaneously being removed from Rome's political sphere. A soldier from Rome who served 25 years would retire to a plot in Germania, surrounded by conquered peoples who hated Rome, isolated from his birth community, unable to return without abandoning his only compensation for decades of service. This wasn't gratitude. This was exile with a plow. And it was systematic. The Senate knew exactly what it was doing, creating a class of armed men who could never leverage their military experience into political organization because they were geographically dispersed, economically isolated, and legally prevented from building inheritable wealth that could establish family dynasties. But the real shock comes when you examine what happened to soldiers' unofficial families. Because here's the thing, soldiers had relationships, they had children. The law said these marriages weren't legal, that these children weren't legitimate heirs, but these families existed. Thousands of papyri from Egypt, inscriptions from military camps across the empire, tombstones that say to my dear companion because the word wife was legally unavailable. Women followed legions, lived in camp settlements called canabae, raised children who would themselves join the legions because they inherited nothing, qualified for nothing else, had no legitimate claim to citizenship through their fathers until Caracalla's edict in 212 CE. Read those tombstones again. Soldiers carving memorials to women they'd lived with for decades but couldn't legally marry. Children identified by maternal lineage because paternal legitimacy was forbidden by law. These weren't accidents of record keeping. These were the documented consequences of a system designed to ensure military families couldn't accumulate intergenerational wealth or social status. A senator's son inherited estates, political connections, Senate seats. A soldier's son inherited nothing, not property, not status, not even legitimate citizenship in many cases, and was thus forced into military service himself, perpetuating the cycle. Understand the machinery here. Rome built a hereditary military underclass by legally preventing soldiers from passing anything to their children except the necessity of military service. The evidence is scattered across hundreds of sources because no single document reveals the full system. That would be too obvious, too damning. But piece it together. The Digest of Justinian preserves military legal codes explicitly forbidding property acquisition. Tacitus mentions centurions executed for maintaining estates during service. Egyptian papyri show soldiers using complex legal fictions, holding property through civilian intermediaries, registering purchases under family members' names because they needed economic security, but the law forbade it directly. Tombstone inscriptions reference peculium castrense, soldiers' personal savings held in legal limbo, not quite property, not quite income, theoretically allowed but practically unprotected and subject to confiscation. Military diplomas, the bronze tablets that proved honorable discharge and granted land rights, specifically list what soldiers were finally permitted: legal marriage recognition for existing relationships, legitimacy for children already born, property ownership for land yet to be acquired. That last part is crucial. Soldiers weren't being given permission to keep what they'd accumulated. They couldn't have accumulated anything legally. They were being given permission to start at age 45 what every Roman citizen could do from birth. That's not a benefit. That's the removal of a prohibition after it's already accomplished its purpose. Now, here's where it gets darker, where the real purpose reveals itself. Follow the money. Track whose wealth increased while soldiers were dying in foreign territories, unable to own property. Senatorial families, the same aristocracy that made military policy controlled vast agricultural estates worked by slaves captured in the wars soldiers fought. Those senators profited from conquest directly: provincial governorships, tax farming contracts, grain monopolies, slave markets. But they also profited from soldiers' inability to own property because it meant soldiers could never become economic competitors. A successful merchant could purchase land, build wealth, challenge aristocratic monopolies. A successful soldier could not. Military service was the most dangerous profession in Rome. Combat casualties, disease, accidents, with mortality rates scholars estimate at 40 to 50% over a 25-year term. Most soldiers died before retirement. Their peculium castrense, those savings held in legal limbo, defaulted to the legion, which meant it effectively returned to the state, which meant it returned to senatorial control through military budgets and procurement contracts. Soldiers died defending senatorial wealth while being legally prevented from accumulating any themselves. That's not irony. That's design. Consider what happened during Rome's civil wars when this system broke down temporarily. Julius Caesar promised land to his veterans and delivered not through proper legal channels but through conquest and confiscation, seizing estates from political enemies and distributing them to soldiers. The Senate called it tyranny. But look at what it actually was. Soldiers finally receiving what their service had earned, distributed by a general who needed their loyalty more than he feared senatorial disapproval. The soldiers themselves understood perfectly. They fought for Caesar not just because he was charismatic, but because he offered what the Senate never would: economic security, property ownership, the ability to build inheritable wealth. When Caesar was assassinated, when Mark Antony and Octavian needed veteran support, they made the same promises. The price of soldiers' loyalty was always the thing the Senate had forbidden them to have: property. The Second Triumvirate proscriptions, where wealthy Romans were murdered and their estates seized, weren't just political violence. They were land redistribution to veterans who had finally gained enough power to demand compensation. And even then, notice what happened after. Augustus reconsolidated power and reinstituted property restrictions. He paid off one generation of veterans with seized estates, then immediately reimposed the legal machinery preventing future soldiers from doing the same. The system reasserted itself because the aristocracy understood what was at stake. If soldiers could own property during service, they would become an organized political force capable of challenging senatorial power. The pattern repeats across Roman history every time soldiers gain temporary leverage. After the year of the four emperors in 69 CE, legions king-made emperors, and suddenly soldiers gained rights. The ability to write wills, some property protections, better discharge benefits. But these were temporary concessions granted under crisis, gradually eroded once imperial power stabilized. Septimius Severus in 187 CE finally legalized military marriage and expanded property rights because he needed the legion's absolute loyalty after seizing power through military coup. But even his reforms were limited. Soldiers still couldn't own property in their province of service, couldn't engage in commercial business, couldn't build the kind of wealth aristocrats possessed. The prohibition was relaxed but not eliminated because the fundamental threat remained. Armed men with economic independence might question why they were dying to protect a system that had deliberately impoverished them for centuries. Read the later Roman military codes carefully. Notice the Byzantine Empire maintained similar restrictions into the medieval period. Notice that every major military power since Rome has implemented some version of this system. Restrictions on soldiers' business activities, limitations on property ownership in military zones, policies that prevent serving soldiers from accumulating independent wealth. The justifications have changed. Operational security, unit cohesion, preventing conflicts of interest, but the effect remains the same. Soldiers are kept economically dependent on the military institution, unable to translate their capability for organized violence into independent political or economic power. Modern military housing, base assignment systems, frequent relocations that prevent community integration all serve similar functions. The machinery is more sophisticated now, less overtly brutal, but the principle is identical. Ensure that the people with weapons never become the people with wealth, because wealth enables organization, and organization enables resistance. This changes everything we thought we knew about Roman military success. The narrative you've been taught is that Rome conquered the world through superior discipline, strategic brilliance, military innovation, and those factors mattered. But they existed within a structure designed primarily to prevent soldiers from converting military power into political or economic power. Roman soldiers weren't forbidden from owning property because it made them better fighters. They were forbidden from owning property because the senatorial aristocracy recognized that allowing armed men to accumulate wealth would inevitably lead to those armed men questioning who they were fighting for and why the profits of conquest flowed exclusively upward. Every restriction imposed on soldiers, no legal marriage, no property, no commercial activity, geographic exile upon retirement, served the same purpose, preventing the formation of a veteran political class that could challenge aristocratic monopoly on wealth and power. The property prohibition wasn't a quirk of Roman law. It was the central mechanism by which Rome's elite ensured that the men who built the empire could never claim any ownership of it. The definitive truth is this: Roman soldiers were forbidden from owning property during service because allowing them economic independence would have made them politically dangerous to the aristocracy that exploited their labor. This wasn't ancient history's anomaly, it's the template. Every empire that's existed since has implemented versions of the same system, using different justifications but achieving identical results, keeping armed forces economically dependent and politically neutralized. The soldiers who carved Rome's borders into 3 continents, who died by the millions in foreign territories, who built the infrastructure that connected an empire. Those men were systematically prevented from owning the land they conquered, from building the wealth they protected, from passing anything to their children except the necessity of following the same path. That's not military efficiency. That's structural violence, legally codified, enforced through generations, and then hidden beneath narratives about discipline and honor and service. The victims couldn't speak against it without facing military execution. The law silenced them. History called it strategy. We inherited the story without questioning whose interests that strategy served. So what other military systems are we accepting without asking who benefits from keeping soldiers poor?